Good day, everyone, and welcome to my podcast entitled The Hot Seat Challenge. Are you bored of the same old politically correct telecom interview questions? Do you want to get the real story behind the telecom claptrap? If so, this show is for you. Join me as I grill today's victim, who is brave and bold enough to take the Hot Seat Challenge. So during the next 15 to 20 minutes, I will ask some of the questions around telecom fraud that you've never dared to ask to one of the wholesale industry's guru, the one and only Steve Heap, CTO of Hot Telecom. Steve, welcome to the Hot Seat.
Yes, good afternoon, Isabel.
You're welcome. You're well seated in your seat?
Yes, and I've got my summer clothes on already. It's a lovely day here in West Virginia.
Good to know, Steve. So don't try to sidetrack me from my questions.
Nope.
You won't run away. I'm going to start with the first one. Fraud prevention is on everyone's mind at the moment. At least it sounds like it is, with all the carriers, talking more and more about how they can prevent both voice and messaging fraud for themselves and their customers. And this week we saw an intriguing piece of news talking about a new type of fraud on the messaging side called SMS Hijack. What is this all about? Should carriers and more importantly ourselves as messaging users be worried about this new fraud?
Yes, it's an intriguing issue. I saw the articles about it earlier in the week and thought I ought to dig further into how it was working. It turned out not to be a fraud in the sense of fraud in the wild that was being used for real. It was more of a test of systems that was being carried out. And in effect, what it seemed to rely on was something actually that I was involved in creating maybe 10 years ago. And it was all around the issue of global number portability. How do you handle and properly handle messages and calls, voice calls in particular, to carriers all around the world when number portability is moving those numbers in the distant country? And the idea was to build a registry of all of the global numbers and assign them to the operator that currently was handling them. So in effect, it was a global registry of numbers in different countries. Some of that information comes from national databases, some comes from the service providers themselves. And the idea was you could query this database and then route the call appropriately to the correct operator. It appears that process, which was developed by NetNumber, has continued to be used to solve shorter term problems of, well, how does a voice over IP service provider that can't regulatorily obtain a number, say, in the United States, how do they get traffic routed to their customers? And the same process can be used, a sort of lookup of the number, determine the ID of the service provider and route the call to them. And it was that process that was basically being followed in this case. The companies have been established to manage the SMS, the texting ability of corporations, so that instead of the corporation managing it on their own, a company manages it on their behalf. So if a text comes in, they respond to it, they send out marketing texts and so on behalf of the corporation. And where the fraud then sort of came into being is that one of those small companies seemed to have very loose and lax controls over who could assign a number, who could say, this is my number, I want it sent into your server so that I can read the text and so on. They simply wanted a signed piece of paper, which is a very, very lax way of handling that. So that was the root of the problem. It wasn't necessarily that the idea behind these systems was wrong. It was this small company simply had no controls in place. And I believe that particular fraud mechanism has now been stopped by both NetNumber and other companies tightening procedures. And I think the US mobile operators have also made it much more difficult to handle that from mobile numbers that they control. So I don't think it's a fraud that we should be worried about. But where it then took me, and I know this is maybe the subject of another discussion in the future, was the whole problem of omni-channel marketing. And omni-channel marketing is where a corporation has many different ways that a customer can contact them. They can phone them, they can send text, they can use WhatsApp, they can use Twitter, they can use a website. There are endless mechanisms to contact the corporation. But each of those is separate. And so in the corporation's mind, if a customer phones them one day and then sends a text the next day, there's nothing that necessarily links that communication together. And the corporation would like to do that. They would like to have one stream of consciousness between them and the customer. And this mechanism of enabling someone else to handle text on your behalf or to handle voice calls on your behalf, which seem to be the root of this fraud, does seem to be a mechanism that could be used to handle the omni-channel challenge. It's a very difficult set of words to say. And so I think out of a problem, or out of the demonstration of a problem, has potentially, come an idea for how some of these capabilities could handle other questions that the industry is grappling with.
And I think it's nice to see maybe for a change something good will come out of something that initially started as a bad or a negative thing. And I agree with you. Omnichannel is super interesting. How to put the customer truly at the center of their experience and to have a personalized experience throughout in real time almost. And I remember when we talked about it, we wrote an interesting article that will be published soon for Telefonica. We wrote in partnership with Telefonica, looking into that opportunity for carriers. What role could they play really to be at the center of making a true customer experience 360-degree in real time? So I agree with you. It should be maybe the topic of our next podcast, but let's stay on the topic. Today, we're here to talk about fraud prevention. And as I said initially, the carriers are talking more and more about fraud prevention, how they can instill it in their organization for themselves and for their customers. But sometimes we wonder, is it more talk than action? Are they using that as a marketing tool to promote the fact that they're doing things, but really in real life, it's not as effective or it's not as acted upon as it should? So you're the fraud prevention guru. If there was one thing that carrier that are really serious about preventing fraud should do to either stop it or at least minimize it, what should it be?
Okay, interesting question. Because telecom fraud and international fraud in particular is a very attractive place to be for many criminals, because there's a lot of cash floating around, hundreds, millions of dollars potentially between different operators. And you've got two groups of clever people. You've the people in the industry that know how it works and how the systems, the signaling systems work, and you've got equally clever people that are looking for holes in that mechanism, both technical holes and procedural holes, so that they can generate some quick cash, get that cash and run away with it, in effect. I think most of the telecom industry is actually trying to keep a lid on this, even though they may not themselves be the people that are being defrauded. That's often the retail service provider or the enterprise with the PBX that's broken into. But the international carriers are in the middle of passing the money around, passing the money from, in effect, the persons that's been frauded to the group that's going to collect the cash at the end of the day. And it struck me that one of the biggest issues in the world of fraud is the international revenue share fraud. And that's where in many countries around the world, there are premium rated telephone numbers. Maybe they're used for horoscopes. People used to say, well, of course, people were willing to pay for horoscopes. But many of them are just set up to make money. There's not necessarily any social good that comes out of it. And it sort of struck me that you obviously can't go to every country in the world and say you can't have these premium numbers. They don't provide any useful service to anyone. But you could say, of course, premium numbers can run in your country. That's up to you and your regulator and government and all the rest of it. If people in your country want to call them, then go ahead, build some services on those. What you could question is whether the international networks need to play a part in that. Is there truly a demand from the US for recorded information services in Poland, or just to pick some country at random? Probably not. I think the valid uses of Polish premium services in the US, it's pretty small. And so you could potentially see the international carriers getting together and saying, from now on, we're no longer going to carry these numbers. I'm not sure who regulates them to carry the numbers. I don't believe anyone does, to the best of my knowledge. A large group of the operators could say, we're not going to carry these numbers any longer. And who would complain? Which group of customers would say, our service, would I go along to Comcast and say, I can't phone this premium number in Poland anymore? Very, very unlikely. And that would actually put the stop to the vast majority of the premium rate fraud at the drop of a hat. So maybe that's something. It's not a technical solution. It's just we as a group are not going to carry this traffic any longer.
So, Steve, you've been around the block a few times, huh? You've done it all. You've seen it all. If you could change one thing in the industry, what would it be?
Yes, that's an even harder question than the previous one, because it's an industry that has evolved constantly. It's not an industry that you could say it's just set in its ways, because I think it's changed as much as any industry that you could point to, both technically from the old TDM days through voice over IP and so on, as well as organizationally and culturally and so on. So I think it has already changed quite a lot. In terms of, let me think, what could it change now? I think that discussion on fraud is one that the industry could well worth discussing. And I wish I'd thought of it quite a number of years ago. I think the one thing that I think could have made a big difference in the industry, maybe if it had been implemented differently or managed differently, was the whole trading idea behind Arbinet. I was a CTO for a number of years there, and I think the concept of what was trying to be achieved there was a very efficient marketplace. Now, maybe they were trying to get too much money, maybe it wasn't done very well, all sorts of reasons why that didn't work. But that's, I think, something that could well be looked at in the industry now, and potentially it's time to do that, because the industry has become very commoditized, and maybe a very efficient trading mechanism is what the industry needs right now.
So, Steve, let's finish on a high. Let's see if you can remain standing after this little challenge, which I like to call the quick or the dead. I will tell you one word and tell me the first word that comes to your mind. Ready?
Okay.
Fraud prevention.
Money.
Fake traffic.
One word. Revenue, profit.
Shaken and stirred.
Tricky.
Wholesale.
Cheap and nasty. Oh, that's 3 words.
And finally, last but not least, hot.
Telecom.
So, Steve, that's it. You're standing. You've survived the hot seat challenge. It wasn't too painful.
It was excellent. Thank you.
You have been a really good guest, and I hope we can do this again. I mean, we have many topics we could talk about in the next few months, and I hope you will accept if I invite you again. And let's see where this takes us.
Okay, that's good to see you again.
So everyone, thank you for listening. Stay cool, be hot, and until the next Hot Seat Challenge.